Authorities in Mississippi have located a body they believe likely belongs to a teen missing since the 4th of July.
Let's start with today and work backwards, because the title makes a promise the record only half keeps. Yes, Nolan Wells's family has spoken out. No, the autopsy has not exposed shocking new details in the way that phrase suggests. Its defining result is a single word: undetermined. Most recently, Nolan's parents stood in front of a room of journalists and asked for one thing: an honest, thorough investigation and the same respect any family would get. That's the update. That's them speaking out. Now walk back to the document everyone keeps calling shocking. The independent autopsy could not determine a cause of death. It could not determine a manner of death. It noted one physical finding: a discoloration at the back of the head, and said plainly that its cause is unknown. That is not proof of anything. It is a set of open questions. So let's separate what the family said from what the autopsy actually found. No one has been charged. No one has been named a suspect. Let's pull the camera in tight on the timeline itself, because that's where this case starts to feel strange. We're looking at July 4th, 2026. A holiday, a day on the water. Here's what we know from the GPS data, and officials have been clear about this. The boat left Horn Island around 4:31 p.m. It docked about an hour and a half later, at 6:06 p.m. That's the hard record. But now, here's the detail that stops you. Nolan Wells was last seen around 3 p.m. that afternoon. Not on the boat ride back, not at the dock, at 3 o'clock. That's the last confirmed sighting of him. So let's do that math together. The boat leaves at 4:31. He's last seen at 3 o'clock. That's a gap of over 90 minutes that we don't have on record. And then the very next detail makes it worse. He wasn't on the boat when it came back. The group returned to the dock at 6:06, and Nolan wasn't with them. Now, the family has been direct about this. They say they do not believe he stayed on that island by choice. They say it plainly. They also say they don't believe his death was an accident. They point to one thing over and over: Nolan would not have separated from the group. That's what his parents have told reporters. So we have a young man last seen at 3 p.m., a boat that leaves without him at 4:31, and a body found 2 days later, on July 6th. That's the skeleton of the timeline, and it's brutal, but here's where it gets complicated. The independent autopsy, the one the family paid for, was done by Dr. Roger Mitchell Jr. in Washington, D.C. They flew Nolan's body there specifically to get a second look, away from Mississippi authorities. That's how much they wanted answers. And Dr. Mitchell's report, released around July 22nd, is a document full of frustrating, careful language. Cause of death, undetermined. Manner of death, undetermined. He found no bone fractures. He found no deep tissue injuries. He did find a red discoloration at the back of the head, but here's the part you need to hear: he couldn't determine what caused it. So the report doesn't give the family the answer they wanted, but it also doesn't give the state the answer they wanted. And that's where the two sides start to diverge. Dr. Mitchell was working with a body that had been significantly decomposed. That's a fact. And because of that, he couldn't assess one of the most important questions in this case: whether drowning played a role. The organs needed for that examination had been removed during the earlier state autopsy. He also couldn't rule out a neck injury. He said that explicitly. And he couldn't rule out non-accidental factors. He said that too. He urged further investigation. So now we have two autopsies. The independent one says, we can't determine cause or manner, and we can't rule out foul play. The state one, which is still sealed, is waiting for a grand jury. Here's what the state medical examiner has said, and it's a direct contrast. They say their autopsy followed standard procedures. They've cautioned against unfounded speculation. So you have the family's expert saying, we can't rule things out, and the state's office saying, we followed the rules. Those are two very different statements, and they're not the same thing. Now about the friends. This is where you need to be careful, because there's a lot of noise online. The facts are these. No one has been charged in Nolan's death. No suspect has been named. The friends who were on that trip have not been charged, and they have been cooperating. But separately, 3 people were charged with making threats connected to this case. Not with the death, with threats. And in response, 3 of Nolan's friends raised more than $125,000 for a legal defense fund. That's a fact, and it tells you how toxic the online atmosphere has become. So we're left with a timeline that doesn't line up, an autopsy that raises more questions than it answers, and a family that is publicly, desperately asking for one thing: the same respect they say anyone else would get. Christine and Elmore Wonsley stood in front of the cameras in Atlanta on August 13th. They said they want honesty, they want transparency, they want a thorough investigation. And the mother, Christine, has made a promise. She says she will not stop seeking answers, not until she gets them. So the question isn't just what happened on Horn Island that afternoon. The question is whether the system will actually tell her the truth. And that's where we have to look at the 90 minutes we're missing. Because the last time anyone saw Nolan Wells was at 3 p.m., and the boat didn't leave until 4:31. So what happened in that hour and a half? That's the gap, and it might be the whole case. But to answer that question, what happened in those 90 minutes, we have to go backward, all the way to the week before the family ever made that promise in Atlanta. Because back then, the story was even thinner. The pieces we have now, they didn't exist yet. So let's rewind, step by step, and at every stop, we'll ask the same thing. What did we know at that moment? Start with August 13th. That's the day Christine and Elmore Wonsley spoke publicly in Atlanta. According to TheGrio, they asked for one thing above all: the same respect that would be given to anybody else. That phrase, the same respect, was their way of saying the investigation wasn't there yet. But that public moment wasn't the beginning. It was the result of weeks of frustration. Go back 3 weeks. Around July 22nd, the independent autopsy was released. NBC News, NPR, and CBS News all reported it. The pathologist, Dr. Roger Mitchell Jr., had examined Nolan's body, and his findings were not what a grieving family wants to hear. Cause of death? Undetermined. Manner of death? Undetermined. No bone fractures, no deep tissue injuries, but a red discoloration at the back of the head. And even that, he said, cause undetermined. So the family's own expert gave them a report that closed nothing. But here's the thing. That report didn't just appear out of nowhere. The family had already set it in motion. According to CBS News and CNN, around July 7th, they retained attorney Ben Crump. That's the same Ben Crump who's represented families in some of the most high-profile death cases in this country. And then they did something even more telling. They had Nolan's body flown to Washington, D.C., their own pathologist, someone with no ties to Mississippi law enforcement. Think about what that means. A family doesn't do that when they trust the local system. They do that when they believe the local system might not give them the truth. Now go back one more day, July 6th. That's the day Nolan's body was found. According to the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources, his body was discovered that day, and officials immediately urged the public not to rush to conclusions. They said that out loud, but the GPS data was already out there, and that data had already started to tell a story that was hard to ignore. Because here's the timeline, and you need to hear it carefully. The boat left Horn Island around 4:31 p.m. on July 4th. It docked about 6:06 p.m. That's from the Department of Marine Resources via CBS News and locks. Those are verified times. But Nolan Wells was last seen around 3 p.m. That's verified too. He did not return on that boat. So let's line those up. Last seen at 3. Boat leaves at 4:31. Boat docks at 6:06. Body found 2 days later. That's not a timeline that explains itself. That's a hole, and in that hole there are 90 minutes that nobody has accounted for. The family knew it too. According to CBS News and CNN, they said they do not believe Nolan stayed on that island by choice. They do not believe his death was an accident. And they gave a very specific reason. Nolan would not separate from the group. That's what they told reporters. That's what they believed from the very beginning. Before the attorney, before the autopsy, before the press conference. So now we're back to that afternoon. July 4th, on Horn Island, a group of young people, a boat, a holiday, and a young man who, according to everyone who knew him, would never have wandered off alone. The question has always been the same. What happened in those 90 minutes? But here's the thing we haven't looked at yet. Not what happened on the island, what happened afterward, to the evidence itself. Because the answer to those 90 minutes was always going to run through the autopsy. And that's where the next problem begins. But before we go back to that conversation, we have to stop here. Because this is the moment where everything could have been different. This is the decision point. It didn't happen on Horn Island. It didn't happen on the boat. It happened in the medical examiner's office. And, to be clear, through routine procedure, not through anything anyone has shown to be sinister. The state autopsy came first, and by the time Nolan's body reached the family's second pathologist, some of the tissue that exam would have needed was no longer with the body. Let's back up. Nolan's body was found on July 6th. State officials conducted an autopsy. That's standard. But the family didn't stop there. According to CBS News and CNN, around July 7th, they retained attorney Ben Crump, and they made a decision. They flew Nolan's body to Washington, D.C., to a pathologist with no ties to Mississippi law enforcement. That decision changed the shape of this case. The pathologist's name is Dr. Roger Mitchell, Jr. On July 22nd, his findings were released. According to NBC News and NPR, he listed both the cause and the manner of death as undetermined. Not an accident, not homicide, not drowning. Undetermined. That word matters. Undetermined doesn't mean nothing happened. It means the evidence can't tell us what happened, and the evidence was already incomplete. Dr. Mitchell found no bone fractures, no deep tissue injuries, but he documented a red discoloration at the back of Nolan's head. Cause? Undetermined. Why couldn't he say more? Because the body he received wasn't whole. According to NBC News and CBS News, the organs had been removed during the earlier state autopsy. Parts of the throat and neck were not there. So Dr. Mitchell couldn't assess drowning. He couldn't rule out a neck injury. The body was significantly decomposed. No toxicology was performed. He said he could not rule out non-accidental factors, and he urged further investigation. Let that sit with you. A forensic pathologist looked at the remains of an 18-year-old and said he could not rule out non-accidental factors. That's a formal way of saying this might not have been an accident. But there's also the official state autopsy. According to CBS News and WellBT, the state medical examiner said its autopsy followed standard procedures. It cautioned against unfounded speculation. And here's the catch. That autopsy is complete, but it's sealed, pending grand jury review. You can't read it. We can't read it. The public gets Dr. Mitchell's finding, undetermined. The official finding stays locked away. So now we have two autopsies, one open, one sealed. One says undetermined, one is hidden. And Nolan's family is standing in the middle. According to TheGrio, on August 13th, Nolan's parents, Christine and Elmore Wonsley, stood in front of journalists at the NABJ convention in Atlanta. They asked for honesty, for transparency, for a thorough investigation. And they asked for that same respect that would be given to anybody else. That phrase is doing a lot of work. It tells you exactly what they think they're not getting. And Nolan's mother has made it even more personal. According to TheGrio, she has shared public tributes vowing not to stop seeking answers. Not stopping isn't a suggestion, it's a promise. But here's where this case stands right now. According to CNN, The Washington Post, and the Detroit News, as of August 2026, no one has been charged in Nolan Wells's death. No suspect has been named. The friends who were on that boat have not been charged. They have been cooperating. Separately, 3 people were charged with making threats connected to the case, not with the death. And the friends raised more than $125,000 in a legal defense fund after threats and false accusations. Think about that. You have an undetermined autopsy, a sealed official autopsy, and a group of friends who needed a legal defense fund. Those 3 things don't fit together easily. But they all trace back to the same decision point. We don't know exactly where that point is. Maybe it's the moment the organs were removed before Dr. Mitchell ever saw the body. Maybe it's the official autopsy sitting sealed. Maybe it's the threats that followed the friends instead of the facts. We can't see it yet. But Dr. Mitchell saw enough to say this: further investigation is needed. Undetermined isn't a conclusion. It's an invitation. And the question now is, who's going to take the next step? Next, what happened in the days after that autopsy, and why the Friends Legal Defense Fund might be the key to everything. Let's go back to what we actually knew on July 4th. According to data from the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources, reported by CBS News and Locks, the boat left Horn Island at about 4:31 that afternoon. It docked at about 6:06. Nolan Wells was last seen around 3 p.m. He was not on that boat when it docked. His body was found 2 days later, on July 6th. That was the whole story then. An 18-year-old went to an island. He didn't come back, and officials urged the public not to rush to conclusions. Fair enough. At that moment, almost nothing was knowable. But watch what happened next. According to CBS News and CNN, the family retained attorney Ben Crump around July 7th, 3 days after Nolan went missing. That's not a slow decision. And they had Nolan's body flown to Washington, D.C., to a pathologist with no ties to Mississippi law enforcement. That's a second signal. The family was not waiting for the official version. So what became knowable after that? According to NBC News, NPR, and CBS News, the independent autopsy, released around July 22nd, found the cause undetermined. The manner undetermined. No bone fractures, no deep tissue injuries, and a red discoloration at the back of the head whose cause was undetermined. But the deeper knowledge came from what Dr. Roger Mitchell Jr. could not examine. According to NBC News and CBS News, he could not assess drowning. The organs had been removed during the earlier state autopsy. He could not rule out a neck injury. Parts of the throat and neck were not in the body when he received it. No toxicology was performed. The body was significantly decomposed. And he said he could not rule out non-accidental factors. He urged further investigation. Let's stop and think about what that means. On July 4th, we knew a young man was missing on an island. That's all. Today, we know the official autopsy happened first. Then the family's pathologist got what was left, and the parts that could settle the biggest questions, the organs, the neck, the throat, were not available to him. What we gained in July was a comparison. And the comparison shows a gap. The family's pathologist couldn't rule out a neck injury. The official finding is still sealed until the grand jury reviews it. To the family, that combination doesn't feel like transparency, and that grievance is theirs to make, even though sealing an autopsy before a grand jury is a routine legal step. The family has been direct about their position. According to CBS News and CNN, they do not believe Nolan stayed on the island by choice. They do not believe his death was an accident. And they point to something specific. Nolan would not separate from the group. That's a statement about who he was. And it's a statement, the family's statement, about the friends who were on that boat. Those friends are cooperating. No one has been charged. But the public was warned on July 4th not to rush to judgment. And by August, the friends had raised more than $125,000 to defend against threats and false accusations. The process moved slowly. The judgment didn't wait. So let's be honest about what's knowable. Then, a body on an island, and a warning not to speculate. Now an undetermined cause, a sealed official record, and a family that won't accept undetermined as the final word. The gap between then and now was supposed to close as investigators worked. In some ways, it only got wider. And here's the measure of it. Nolan was last seen around 3 p.m. The boat left Horn Island at about 4:31. That's roughly 90 minutes. 90 minutes between the last time Nolan was seen and the moment that boat left. Everything this case has become traces back to that stretch of time. And nobody, not the official autopsy, not the independent one, has ever closed it for us. The grand jury still has the record. Nolan's family is still waiting. Next, what they're doing while that record stays sealed, and why they say they won't stop. So what are they doing while that record stays sealed? They're speaking. They did not go quietly. On August 13th, according to TheGrio, Christine and Elmore Wonsley stood before journalists at the NABJ convention in Atlanta. They asked for honesty, transparency, a thorough investigation, and something simpler, the same respect that would be given to anybody else. That phrase carries weight. According to CBS News and CNN, the family had already retained attorney Ben Crump around July 7th, 3 days after Nolan disappeared, 1 day after his body was found. Then they had Nolan's body flown to Washington, D.C., so a pathologist with no ties to Mississippi law enforcement could take an independent look. That look gave them more questions. Dr. Roger Mitchell Jr. reported undetermined cause and manner. No fractures, no deep tissue injuries, but a red discoloration at the back of the head he couldn't explain. And with the organs already removed and the neck and throat missing, he couldn't rule out a neck injury. He urged further investigation, according to NBC News and CBS News. The state, meanwhile, says its autopsy followed standard procedures. According to CBS News and WOL-BT, the state medical examiner cautioned against unfounded speculation. But the official report is still sealed. It's in front of a grand jury. The family hasn't seen it. The public hasn't seen it, and that's where the process becomes its own kind of wall. Here's what we do know. Nolan Wells was 18. He played wide receiver at Southwest Mississippi Community College. He went on a July 4th boat trip to Horn Island with friends. He was last seen around 3 p.m. The boat left at 4:31. According to Mississippi Department of Marine Resources data via CBS News and Locks, it docked at 6:06, an hour and a half on the water. Nolan wasn't on it. The boat left without him. His body was found 2 days later. No one has been charged, no suspect named. The friends on that trip have been cooperating, but according to CNN and the Washington Post, they raised more than $125,000 for a legal defense fund after threats and false accusations. 3 other people were charged with making threats connected to the case, not with his death. That's the environment this case has created, where friends need defense funds just to protect themselves from threats. Now, those answers still haven't come, but the family has made its position clear. According to CBS News and CNN, they don't believe Nolan stayed on the island by choice. They don't believe this was an accident. They keep saying he would not separate from the group. They knew him better than any record will. That's not forensic detail. That's a mother and father telling you who their son was. And they have refused to let that person disappear behind the paperwork. Christine Wonsley has shared public tributes vowing not to stop. According to TheGrio, she has made that promise publicly, again and again. She has said her son's name in front of cameras and in writing. On August 13th, she stood in Atlanta and asked for the same respect that would be given to anybody else. That respect hasn't arrived. The record is still sealed. The finding is still undetermined. But the family is still waiting. The clock is still running. But Nolan Wells is not a file. He was 18. He was a wide receiver. He was someone's whole world. And until the record opens, his mother's voice is going to keep going. Because that is what love does. It doesn't wait for a grand jury. And neither should the truth. But the truth hasn't spoken yet. And when it finally does, we'll be listening with her.